welcome to the presentation today. I'm very excited to be talking with you about Git Bisect. My name is David Needham. I'm a developer advocate at Pantheon, where I create training curriculum and present workshops just like what we're about to talk about today. Throughout my job at Pantheon, I get exposed to all sorts of interesting technologies and libraries and techniques that other agencies are experimenting with. I get to go to a lot of conferences and watch some presentations. This presentation was actually inspired by another presentation where I was introduced to Git Bisect. So I'm very excited to share it with you. This is the first time presenting it. Feedback is definitely welcome, so if you have feedback throughout, please do write it down and share it with me afterwards so I can make it even better. All right, so when I'm not working at Pantheon, I do a little bit of volunteer work. I volunteer for a nonprofit organization, a documentary, actually. Oh, it's not working. There we go. A documentary, a World War II documentary called The Girl Who Wore Freedom. Since I do web stuff, I have some experience I can lend to this, so I help out with their website. Well, one day, I'm scrolling around the website, just kind of doing normal maintenance things or updating blog posts or the podcast, and I notice, at the bottom, we usually have this subscribe to our newsletter sort of widget that is from MailChimp. That was gone. I had no idea why it was gone. I didn't know when it disappeared. I didn't know what was added or removed that could have caused something like that to happen. All I noticed is that it wasn't where it used to be. It wasn't working. 1 hour went by, still could not figure out where it was coming from. Another hour went by. I hadn't built the site. Someone else built it. I sort of inherited it partway through. I had no idea how they built that form to begin with. There was no MailChimp embed there. There was no MailChimp, this is a WordPress site, so plugin or anything like that. Another hour goes by. I still have no idea what happened. Eventually, I was able to resolve the issue, but I wouldn't have wasted 3 hours or more trying to debug this if I had known about Git Bisect back then. Let me show you why. So let's just, for the sake of this example, say that these are all of the commits that have happened. We have about 100 here. We have going up from commit number 0, 1, all the way up to head, which is where I'm at right now. So with Git Bisect, I have a sort of simulated terminal here at the bottom. With Git Bisect, you go to the root, your folder where your repository starts. Oh, and I should say real quick, there are some prerequisites to this. Of course, you have to be using Git. Okay, in order to use Git Bisect, you have to have the Git commits, the version, the history there. And you also have to make mistakes. As someone here pointed out earlier, it doesn't apply to him. He doesn't make mistakes. That's okay. You probably don't need it unless you make mistakes. So you just get started by going into this folder. Maybe you commit whatever work you have pending or anything like that. You get it kind of clean. And then you just start with Git Bisect start. After you run that command, you identify where the bad commit is. In this case, we know that it's bad right now. So we just type in Git Bisect bad, and it assumes that it's right where you are at this point in history. It's bad. And then you say Git Bisect good, and you point to a good commit. In this case, I'm saying the hash for the first commit. You could also do a tag, you could do a branch, you could do whatever you want to identify what was broken. And so we've done that there with the green circle there. And then, after you do Git Bisect good, it starts doing its thing. Git Bisect will say bisecting. There are X number of revisions between the good one and the bad one. In this case, there are 98. And it says that it can figure out where this happened in roughly 6 steps. All right, so 6 steps, I can figure this out. And then it checks out a commit that's roughly halfway in between. Now, since this is a demonstration, it's perfectly 50 because it's 1 to 100, and that's great. It checks out that commit, and then we go and check to see if it's working or not. We go to our site, we go to our code, depending on what kind of a site this is, or if this is just your repository or whatever. You go see if it's working the way you'd expect it to, and then you answer the question. So you can say, "This is good," with Git Bisect good, and if we do this, let's just continue through the presentation. If we say this is good, then it knows all of the commits before that are good. If 1 to 50 are all good, that's half of our entire commit history that we don't even have to think about. It's not relevant. So now we've reduced our options here. We're down to 49 revisions left to test after this, and there are roughly 5 more steps remaining. And it's checking out commit number 75, which has the commit hash here at the bottom. It has the commit message, and so we can see, like, oh, updating various plugins. Maybe I updated a plugin that broke it. So it's checked out. I go to the code. I pull it up. Still not there. Still not working. So I say, nope, this is a bad one. I say, git bisect bad. And so now it knows everything between 75 and where I was before is bad. Okay, so let's just keep going. So it says, okay, well, halfway between this is 62. Check this out. Well, that one's good. So we clear that off. Well, here we go, 68. That one's good. So we clear that out. And it just keeps going, getting closer and closer, narrowing down the scope until we figure out where the problem is. And in this case, this is sort of the clincher, right? Because if commit number 74, which in this case it says removing plugins that aren't used, hey, that might be a hint there. If I answer yes, this works, then we know that the one that's faulty is number 75, because number 75 was the one that didn't work most recently. If I say this one doesn't work, then we know it's 74, because it's the closest one, the furthest back that's broken. So in this case, it was bad. It was not working after committing commit number 74. And so it points out what happened. It gives me the commit. It gives me the history. Of course, I made that commit. It was my fault. Because I didn't build the site, I was doing due diligence, going through, cleaning up some of the plugins and the themes and things that just weren't being used anymore, as we had been experimenting with different things. I had removed a plugin that was used for creating callouts and creating all sorts of various elements and like pop-ups and things. Didn't think it was being used for the newsletter. Apparently it was, because as soon as I reverted this commit, it was working. All right, so once we kind of get to this point, we've identified what the problem is, we get to start over, basically. We do a git bisect reset to totally reset our history. We're now back to head, but we know which commit caused the problem. We can then go back, see what code changed, add in that plugin again, and go about our day. This entire process, these commands that I just ran, are all happening in pretty much real time with what you just saw. So instead of taking 3 hours or more to figure out where a problem was introduced, I just run a few commands, and in a matter of 8 minutes or less, I've identified it, it's pulled out the commits, and it's ready to go. Now, one thing worth noting here, though, is because we have a CMS, because we're using Drupal or WordPress or whatever you might be using, we're not just looking at code. The complicating factor here is we would also have to check out a database backup, depending on all the other things that are happening, and that gets to be a little bit complicated. So that might be something worth noting. You want to make sure that you have backups that go back as far as you need to go to do things like this. And for that reason, this becomes a little bit more elegant or a little more of a better use case if you're doing regular coding, if you're working on a custom module, if you're doing things that are more code-focused and not reliant on a database, it might work a little bit better. However, it still saved a ton of time, even with having to go and download the backups and re-upload those. Right, so some things that are worth noting as you're going through and trying Git Bisect, some tips and tricks that I've learned along the way. First of all, it helps if you have your site installed locally. If you download your site, you have it all running locally, it's going to go a lot faster because you're working against the repo locally, and you also have the database and all those things right at your fingertips. Also, it can be really helpful to write down, just like pad of paper, write down the steps that you're doing to make sure that it's working or not. So if you need to go through these 5 steps, I need to log in, go to this page, go to the bottom of the page and see if it's there. Those are just 3 steps, but you want to make sure that you do it consistently the same way every time. So if you have to go, if it's a Drupal site, you want to go to the blogs, the blocks administrative interface. You want to make sure it's there. You want to make sure this setting on this page is particular. Write down each of those steps so that you follow exactly the same pattern every single time. That will make sure that you're consistent and answering correctly on yes or no if it worked or not. Also, you can save some time with the commands that you're running. With our example, we were running git bisect start, git bisect good, and identifying git bisect bad and identifying. But you can do it all streamlined with one command. You can do git bisect start, the bad identifier, and then the good identifier, all with one command, and it will immediately start running git bisect. You can also point out a path to files that you think are suspect, which will dramatically speed up the time that you are analyzing your code. Because if you know, oh, this is a CSS change, it probably happened in our theme, probably in this folder of our theme, and you say git bisect start and then provide the path to where you think it might have happened, it will only look at commits that are changing files in those locations, making your history that you have to pass through much, much smaller. Also, I don't know about you, but occasionally I will make a commit and I have a white screen of death, or it's breaking the site for some other reason, and I'm like, oh crap, I forgot something. I need to go back in, make another commit. Okay, it's fixed, and continue on your way. Well, what happens if throughout the process as you're using git bisect, what if it checks out that commit that gave you the white screen of death? Well, in that situation, you say git bisect skip. For some reason, you can't answer if this is good or bad at this point. And if you do that, it will just skip ahead or behind. It'll pick a different one around that one so that you can try again. Some other really interesting examples, some examples that I've only been able to touch the surface of so far, involve automating git bisect. Now, this is a situation where maybe you don't want to have to answer yes, no over and over again. Maybe you have a huge history that goes back thousands and thousands of commits. It's going to take a long time. You don't want to manually answer yes, no, and actually visually verify. Well, you can write a script that will answer yes, no based on whatever criteria that you provide it. This could also be helpful if you are wanting to automate the process to say, like, every time I make a pull request, or every time maybe not every time you make a commit, but let's verify that it is still working, whatever this bit of code is that I'm doing. Sort of like a typical visual regression test, like I was talking about yesterday, or some other sort of automated testing you might have to verify that you're not about to introduce some sort of a problem. Well, let's take a quick look at this. This is a very simple example, but if you do git bisect run and then anything else, it's going to start looking for an error code, either a 1 or a 0 to say if it passed or it failed. And based on that result, it will answer good or bad in the prompt for git bisect. And the cool thing is that it'll keep doing this over and over again. Like when you start git bisect, and then you say git bisect run test, whatever the test is, it will just just go through all of those commits, all those prompts, answering the question, running the test separately every time. So this is just a very, very simple bash script that I wrote, test.sh. Very simple. It is literally just looking in a file called mycode.php, and it's making sure that this particular function exists in that code. Again, very simple example, making sure that our function is still there. You could run anything that you might run in a bash script in here, though. So if you wanted to put in something that checks for some other response, you could certainly put that there, but let's keep on moving because there are other more interesting ways of testing with this as well. You could also use PHP. So you're not limited to just running bash scripts. You could also use PHP. And so this is an example I took from that presentation that I watched. I have a link here on the bottom if you want to check that out. John Blackbourne's WordCamp US presentation. He had a problem where he had a plugin that was something disappeared from the menu. So he wrote a test that will make sure that that problem never happens again, because it automatically tests every time he's doing a pull request. So for this example, he's actually loading in WordPress. He's setting the current user to 1. He's kicking things off. And then he actually loads up the HTML output, the template for the menu system up at the top of the screen. And then he just makes sure that it's still there. Again, the important takeaway here is you're running the PHP, you're bootstrapping Drupal or WordPress or whatever, you're loading up the test, you're logging in as a user, and then you're ending in either an exit 0 or an exit 1. Based on the answer, based on the response, that is how it'll answer for the Git Bisect. All right, so that's just custom PHP you've written, but you can take it a step further. You can get even more interesting. As I mentioned yesterday, I talked about backstop.js. So what if you could do visual regression testing on your site to take screenshots between two versions, maybe your live site and your local dev site, and then answer the yes, it's working or no, it's not working automatically based on the results of that? Well, you can do that. You can do git bisect run, and then whatever other command that you want. As long as it returns a 1 or a 0 at the end of the day, or at the end of the script, that's all it takes. So you could run a visual regression test, verify that it's there or not, and have it answer your question for you. And if backstop's not your thing, you could also do a bhat test. This can kind of keep going. Like, these are all just examples, but if there are other types of testing, if you like to do unit testing, if there's anything else you can imagine that you could run here that would return a 1 or a 0, you can do that and have it run through Git Bisect.
I will be here.
So there are many situations where Git Bisect could be helpful. I've touched on some of them already. But one example can be if you're inheriting a project. Certainly myself, I had the 100 commits in my history for the example I gave at the beginning. But what if I inherited a project at the end and there are hundreds of commits from someone else? Like, how much less likely am I to find a mistake that someone else made if I don't have any idea where it could be coming from or when it would have happened? So when you're inheriting a project, it can be really helpful to use Git Bisect to quickly find where that problem was at. Also, if you allow your customers to edit code directly, if you hand off a site and at some point this thing, whatever this thing is, it was working at one point, you can use Git Bisect to find where the mistake was made in the code and then go from there. If you have multiple developers on your team, if you're working with other people, again, the kind of what this gets boiled down to is, you don't know where a particular thing happened or when it happened. This can point you to where it happened. And then this last example is preventing regression from happening on the live site itself. If you have a mission-critical bit of code, if you have a mission-critical feature that you want to make sure is always there, you never want it to reach live, then you would probably want to look at the automated tests and have it run every time that you do a pull request or something like that, testing to make sure that your code is not introducing some sort of regression there. Okay, so I have lots of resources that we can link to at the end of the presentation here. So if you want to grab the slides, you can get them from my website. You can link to any of these and get even more information about how to use Git Bisect. And with that, we're a little early, but I'd like to open it to questions. Git Bisect is one of those things that, kind of like the visual regression testing talk yesterday, it's very simple. But it was something that I had never heard of before. And so if you've never heard of it before, I would just encourage you to check it out. If you have Git, you already have Git Bisect going. So try it. See if you can find something that happened in the past and go from there. Okay. Any questions? Yes?
If you run into any issues with merges, rebasing, and dealing with those commits, or is it pretty good about it?
So with my limited examples of times that I've used it, I haven't had any of those problems, but I could see how you might. So one option would, it depends on the nature of the problem, how it's being introduced, whether or not you would roll back a commit that you did, how long ago it was, or just make a new commit that's reversing it, or if you're just grabbing that line of code and putting it back in. Or in my case, I just added the plugin in again. I didn't do anything with Git to rewrite the history or anything. Yes, questions?
When you say clients editing code, are you assuming they're using Git as well?
Well, that would be great, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Because I have a content editor that'll get into the UI and WordPress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, changing.
You can find the broken file.
Yeah. Well, that's a whole different thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can't help you there. Sorry. All right, well, thank you all very much for coming to the presentation. I'll be sticking around. Please do give me feedback. I know it's short. I can work on that. But thank you all very much.
Yeah.